I repaired the Queen's weapon, and she rushed to thank me. The work order said, ceremonial sidearm, Vel class, surface corrosion, firing mechanism jammed. Low priority, return when convenient. Davin Marsh read it twice and set it at the bottom of his intake tray. He was the only human armorer stationed at the Tharovan diplomatic compound, and in the 18 months he'd held the post, he had learned that low priority at the compound meant one of two things. Either the item genuinely didn't matter, a decorative blade with a loose pommel, a staff officer's dress pistol that hadn't been fired in decades, or it was something that mattered enormously, and whoever submitted the work order was hoping nobody would look too closely at it. The third morning, he picked it up. The carrying case was plain gray composite, unremarkable, the kind used for standard field arms across a dozen species and 4 treaty fleets. The latch had been clicked shut with care. Davin set it on his bench, checked his work log, noted the timestamp, and opened it. He understood immediately that this was not a standard ceremonial sidearm. The weapon was approximately 40 centimeters long, Vel class in the broad sense, the frame geometry, the swept trigger guard, the 3-vent exhaust manifold along the barrel casing were all consistent with Vel pattern design, but the tolerances were not standard. He could see that just from looking. The grip panels were iridescent black, worked with inlaid tracery that took him a moment to place as not decorative at all, but functional. The inlay was a circuit continuity indicator, reading green along most of its length and dull in 2 sections near the base of the frame. The frame itself was a metal he didn't immediately recognize, not the usual brass-weight alloy of Vel surplus pieces, but something with a faint violet sheen that suggested either an uncommon alloy or a coating process he hadn't seen before. Surface corrosion, the order said. Davin put on his magnification visor and leaned in. The corrosion was not surface. It was inside the ejector assembly, visible only because someone, he suspected the weapon's owner, had already partially disassembled it and then stopped, either because the internal geometry was unfamiliar or because the damage was worse than expected and they didn't want to commit to a partial fix. There were 3 components laid out in correct sequence beside the frame on a small folded cloth that had been tucked into the case. An ejector rod, a spring retainer, and something he had no immediate name for. A curved blade-like component with a machine track on one edge that he associated with neither standard Vel pattern, nor any of the 11 variants he kept documented in his reference files. He wrote the component down in his notes as unknown part, track blade, curved, possible rate limiter or cycling control, and kept going. The corrosion had started at a seal joint that had been under thermal stress. The carbon scoring on the inside of the casing told him the weapon had been fired hard and often, not in ceremony but in use, and whoever maintained it had sealed the joint with a compound not rated for sustained high temperature. The compound had failed. The failure had let moisture, or more likely atmospheric particulate, given the residue pattern into the assembly, and the ejector spring had oxidized in a way that locked the cycling rod at partial extension. That was the jam. The firing mechanism was secondary. He found the fault there in under a minute. The sear engagement was off by a margin narrow enough that it would pass visual inspection and would function for slow, deliberate fire, but would skip under rapid cycling, which matched the wear pattern on the hammer face. Someone had adjusted the sear without measuring it first. Both problems were fixable. The ejector spring needed to be replaced, and the oxidation cleared from the rod. The sear needed to be reset, and the engagement surface polished. The seal joint needed to be stripped and redone with a compound rated for high thermal load. The unknown part, the track blade, was undamaged. He photographed it from 4 angles, noted its dimensions, and set it aside carefully. He spent the first morning disassembling the weapon fully, cleaning each component, documenting everything. He spent the afternoon on research. The Therovan compound library had 3 reference volumes on Velpattern arms, and cross-referencing them with his own documentation took him 2 hours. He did not find the track blade in any of them. What he found instead was a note in the 2nd volume, appended in a different hand to the Velpattern manufacturing section, that said, "Velpattern arms produced for the royal household bear non-standard components. Do not modify without authorization." Davin sat back in his chair and looked at the open case on his bench. He read the work order again. Ceremonial sidearm Vel class, submitted by Logistics Office, Wing 7, Compound Administration. No name, no rank. The submitting officer number was a standard compound code that traced, when he pulled the directory, to a general administrative contact pool rather than an individual officer. Low priority, return when convenient. He looked at the weapon. He looked at the work order. He thought about the fact that someone had partially disassembled it and stopped, and had then put it in a gray case and submitted it through a general logistics channel, and had marked it low priority. He picked up his tools and kept working. Therovan compound housed, at any given time, somewhere between 300 and 700 personnel from 18 species, the majority of them diplomatic staff, military liaisons, or treaty administrators. Davin had spent most of his career on smaller postings: a naval repair bay, a sector station, 2 years aboard a patrol vessel, and the compound was the largest installation he'd worked at. He had been chosen for the post, he suspected, because of a note in his service record that said he was methodical and kept good documentation. His section chief on the patrol vessel had written it after Davin had spent 3 weeks tracking an intermittent fault in the weapons bus that had evaded 2 previous technicians, had found it in a corroded relay behind a panel that hadn't been opened in 4 years, and had fixed it and written a 4-page report explaining how it had happened. The section chief had meant it as a compliment. Davin had filed it as a standard close-out report. He was, by the standard of the compound, an unremarkable appointment. The armory handled maintenance for 12 delegations and 4 resident military units, and most of the work was routine: cleaning, inspection, parts replacement on weapons that were carried more for ceremony than for use. Occasionally there was something interesting, a non-standard mechanism, an old weapon brought in by a senior officer with a story attached to it, but mostly it was cleaning carbon fouling from ejector ports and resetting trigger weights and replacing worn grip panels. He was good at it. He was fast, he was accurate, and he had the specific patience that mechanical work required, the willingness to stop and look before touching, to check the work order twice, to write down what he found before reaching for a tool. He was also, after 18 months at the compound, known to the other staff primarily as the quiet human who had once corrected a senior Therovan logistics officer's parts requisition without comment, simply resubmitted it with the correct component numbers and a brief note explaining the error, and who ate his lunch at his bench and kept his tool inventory organized in a way that made visiting technicians uncomfortable, because they couldn't find anything obviously wrong with it to improve. He had 2 friends at the compound, both humans: Yes-Sign, a translator who was warm and loud and made everyone around her feel welcome, and Corin, a medical technician who was quiet like Davin but quieter in a way that suggested thought rather than inattention. Davin ate dinner with them when their shifts aligned. He did not eat with the Therovan officers or the other species liaisons, not because he had been excluded, but because he had never sought to be included, and in the compound's social geometry that amounted to approximately the same thing. He was not lonely. He noticed, sometimes, that he might be, if he were the kind of person who noticed that sort of thing, but he was occupied enough that it didn't register as pressing. He thought about it for the first time in a while on the 2nd day of working on the weapon, when he was seated at his bench with the ejector assembly spread in front of him, and the track blade set to one side, and Yesling came in to return a borrowed reference volume and looked at the bench and said, "That's Royal Household, Davin." He looked up. "How do you know?" She pointed at the frame, still partially disassembled, lying on his work cloth. "The inlay. It's not just a circuit indicator, that's a lineage mark. The pattern indicates first house." She paused. "Where did this come from?" "Work order from Wing 7 Logistics." She looked at him steadily. "You know what that weapon is?" "I'm starting to form a hypothesis," he said. Yesling sat down across from him. "If I'm right about the lineage mark, that weapon belongs to the Queen-Regnant of Tharovan." She watched him. Her personal sidearm, not a ceremonial copy, the actual weapon she carries when she's on site. "The work order says ceremonial." "The work order is wrong, or someone wanted it to look wrong." She stood up. "Whatever you decide, document it." He had already documented it. He pointed at his notepad, where 4 pages of notes and sketches were visible. Yesling looked at the notepad, looked at him, and left. He went back to work. The ejector spring took 2 days to source. The compound's standard parts inventory did not carry Vel-pattern springs in the specific dimension he needed, close, but not exact, and he was not going to install a close-fit component in a weapon that had already been improperly serviced once. He filed a specific parts request, noted the dimension requirement, and waited. While he waited, he worked on the sear. The sear was more complex than it looked. The mechanism was not a standard Vel sear. It was a refined version, the geometry similar but the working surface shaped differently, and when he measured the engagement distance against the reference in his files, he found that the person who had adjusted it had moved it toward the standard spec rather than the original non-standard spec, apparently not knowing they were dealing with a non-standard weapon. The result was that the sear now engaged correctly for a standard Vel, but incorrectly for this one, marginally safe for slow fire, unreliable for rapid cycling, and trending toward a failure mode that would eventually result in a dropped strike. He reset it to the original geometry. He polished the engagement surface carefully. He measured it 3 times. On the 4th day, the ejector spring arrived. He installed it. He cleared the oxidation from the rod, a careful process, more patience than technique, working under magnification with fine tools and a specific solvent, and reassembled the ejector. He stripped the failed seal joint down to bare metal, cleaned it, and resealed it with a high-temperature compound he had to mix from base components because the compound inventory didn't carry it pre-made. That took a day by itself. He let the seal cure overnight. On the 6th day, he function tested the weapon with dummy loads, running it through the cycling sequence 50 times, measuring the timing, checking the ejector, watching the sear. It functioned. It functioned correctly, cleanly, within the tolerances he estimated the original specification had intended. He reassembled the weapon, fitted the track blade. Its installation point had become clear to him on day 3, a channel in the lower frame that the blade's machine track mated to precisely, and set the completed weapon in its case. He looked at it for a moment. Then he picked up the work order and wrote his closeout report. It was longer than his standard reports. It described what he had found, what he had done, and what had been done to the weapon before it reached him. He wrote the closeout report without editorial comment, just the observations and the actions taken, but it was detailed enough that anyone reading it carefully would understand the full sequence of events. He attached the report to the case, latched the case closed, and submitted it to the Wing 7 Logistics return queue. Then he went back to his other work. He didn't think about it again for 3 days. What pulled his attention back was not a visit from Logistics or a communication from Wing 7, but the sound of the outer armory door, the heavy one, the one that opened from the compound's main corridor, opening in the middle of the afternoon. The armory had a front reception area and a rear workshop, connected by a half-open Dutch door. Davin was at his bench in the workshop, midway through servicing a standard field rifle for one of the resident military units, when he heard the outer door. He did not look up immediately. Compound personnel came and went. He expected to hear, after a moment, a voice at the front desk calling for the duty clerk or a knock at the Dutch door. What he heard instead was the sound of the outer door being closed again very quickly, and then a muffled exchange of voices, at least 3 of them, he thought, speaking Tharovan in a tone that registered as urgency even through the wall. He set down his tools. He went to the Dutch door and looked. She was standing in the center of the reception area, and he understood immediately, in the complete, sudden way that left no room for reconsideration, why Yesin had said royal household in that particular tone. He had seen photographs of the Tharovan Queen-Regnant in the compound's diplomatic briefing materials, the same photographs that were distributed to all staff during orientation, formal portraits in court dress with the elaborate ceremonial marks of office. The photographs were official and therefore composed, the subject positioned to project authority. The woman standing in his reception area was not in court dress. She was in a working uniform, dark blue, high-collared military cut, without insignia other than a rank device he recognized as senior command, and she was moving with the specific purposeful energy of someone who had been stopped multiple times by people trying to slow her down and had declined to be slowed. There were 2 guards at the door who had evidently tried to precede her and been left behind. A third figure, an aide from the collar marking, was attempting to stand in a position that looked attentive without looking like he was trying to interpose himself between her and wherever she was going, and not quite managing it. Davin registered all of this in a second, then registered the case. She was carrying the gray composite case. She had it in her right hand, held with a careful grip that suggested she had been holding it for some time. She saw him at the Dutch door. He had worked in enough high-pressure environments, repair bays, naval vessels, one very difficult 6 months on a joint species station, where a structural fault had nearly ended the whole posting, to know that there was a category of situation in which the normal social hierarchy of a workplace became irrelevant, not because it ceased to exist, but because the work made it temporarily beside the point. His section chief on the patrol vessel had been 4 ranks above him, and had once passed him tools for 2 hours without either of them needing to discuss what that meant. He stepped back from the Dutch door and opened the lower half. "Come through," he said. She walked through without hesitation. Her guards made a brief collective noise that she silenced with a single word in Tharovan, and a glance that Davin, turning to lead her to his bench, only caught the edge of. His bench held the disassembled field rifle and 3 trays of components. He cleared a section without fuss and turned. She set the case on the cleared section. She looked at him with eyes that were a deep, layered amber, not the gold he'd seen in the briefing photographs, which he now understood had been a lighting artifact, but something richer and more complex, and he realized she was waiting for him to speak first. "You've read the closeout report," he said. "Yes," her voice was even, not cold, not warm, calibrated. "You found the sear adjustment." Someone reset it toward standard Vel spec. It wasn't, he paused. He was not sure in this moment what level of technical detail was appropriate for this conversation. Then he remembered that she carried this weapon, and that whoever had adjusted the sear had been working on it before it came to him, and he made a decision. "It wasn't going to hold," he said. "Not under rapid fire. The engagement surface was wearing in the wrong direction." Something shifted in her expression. He filed it, kept going. "I reset it to original spec. The ejector spring was the main mechanical failure. The oxidation had locked the cycling rod. I replaced the spring and cleared the rod. The seal joint was redone with a high-temperature compound. It should hold now." He paused. "I'd recommend a field test before you rely on it in a serious situation, but I measured the function at 50 cycles with dummy loads, and it was within tolerance each time. She opened the case. He watched her, because it was his work, and watching what a client did with returned work was professional habit. She lifted the weapon with both hands, held it for a moment, not examining it, he thought, but feeling it, the way someone handled something they'd carried for a long time, and then checked the chamber, engaged and disengaged the safety twice, and dry-cycled the action. The action was smooth. He knew it would be. He'd cycled it himself 50 times, and he knew what it sounded like. She did it again, then she looked up at him. 18 months, she said. I've had 3 different technicians look at this. None of them found the sear. He thought about the track blade, lying in its channel in the lower frame, the way it had taken him 3 days to understand what it was. He thought about the reference note in the second volume, the one about royal household weapons bearing non-standard components, and about how you had to read all 3 volumes to find it. The geometry is close enough to standard Vel that you'd miss it if you weren't measuring, he said. The person who adjusted it probably thought they were helping. They were not helping. No, they weren't, he paused. I didn't know whose weapon it was when I started. The work order said ceremonial. She held his gaze for a moment. There was something in it he couldn't immediately categorize, not the composed authority of the briefing photographs, something more direct than that. I know, she said. I wrote the work order. He thought about that. Why? Because I needed it repaired, and I had already had it looked at twice through proper channels, and the result each time was a report that told me the weapon was functional. It was not functional. I thought if I submitted it as an unremarkable item through an unremarkable channel, whoever received it might actually look at it, rather than looking at the work order. Davin said nothing for a moment. And your name on the order, she said, came from a recommendation. Whose recommendation? A translator on staff. Yes, then, a pause. She told me you had once returned a corrected parts requisition to a logistics officer without comment. She said you were the kind of person who fixed the actual problem. He filed that away too. He thought about Yes-Sign, who was warm and loud and had come into his workshop to return a borrowed reference volume at a specific moment, and had told him what she knew, and had said, whatever you decide, document it. I'm glad it works, he said. She had not looked away from him. He noticed, now that he was paying attention to it, that her attention had a quality, not pressure, but weight, that was different from most of the ambient social interaction at the compound. Most people looked at him the way people looked at technical staff, acknowledgement of function rather than presence. She was looking at him the way someone looked when they actually wanted to know what they were looking at. I came to thank you, she said. Properly. That is why I came myself rather than sending a message. I read the work order, he said. This is what the work was. I know what work orders say. She turned the weapon in her hands, held it for a moment, and set it carefully back in the case. A Vel-pattern royal household arm has not been repaired correctly outside of the royal household workshops in, I have looked this up, approximately 60 years. The workshops have been closed for the last 8 years. A pause. You are the first person in 8 years who has managed it. Davin thought about the 3 reference volumes, and the 2 hours cross-referencing them, and the note in the second volume, and the parts request for the non-standard spring dimension, and the night he had spent mixing the seal compound from base components, because the compound inventory didn't carry it. The documentation exists, he said. You have to know to look for it. You looked for it. It's what I do. She studied him. He had the sense, not uncomfortable exactly but notable, that she was filing him the same way he filed things carefully, with intent to retrieve. I would like to ask you a question, she said. You may decline to answer. Go ahead. The close-out report, she said. You described the prior servicing in detail. You did not identify who had performed it. You had access to the weapon's maintenance history. It was in the case. A pause. Why did you not include the technician's name? He thought about that. The maintenance history had been in the case, tucked under the cloth that held the 3 laid-out components. He had read it on the first day. The last servicing before this one had been recorded with a name and a rank. Because the report was about the weapon's condition and what I did to correct it, he said, not about assigning fault. She was quiet for a moment. The prior technician made decisions that caused harm, she said. It wasn't an accusation at him. It was the statement of a problem. He made incorrect decisions, Davin said. He was probably working from a standard VEL reference, because that's what's available in most service libraries. The non-standard documentation is hard to find. That's an information problem more than a personnel problem. He paused. If you want, I can write up a reference for the specific component differences and make it available to the compound service library. She looked at him. The quality of her attention, which he had been noting, shifted in a way he couldn't precisely name. Yes, she said, I would like that. I'll have it done in 2 days. She closed the case. Her aide, who had been standing at the Dutch door with the specific posture of someone professionally invisible, made a small movement that might have been relief. Your name, she said. In the work order, it was listed as duty armorer. Davin Marsh. She said it once under her breath, not to him, testing the sound of it. Davin. Then, in a register that had formality in it but not the coldness he might have expected, I am Sarah Velnareth, which you already know. Yes. Then we are even, she said, and for the first time since she'd walked through the Dutch door, she showed something that was not composed authority. It was not a smile exactly, more a shift in the set of her mouth, brief, controlled, but it was readable. She picked up the case. She walked back through the Dutch door. He heard the outer door open and close, then the muffled voices of her guards receding. He stood at his bench for a moment. Then he picked up his tools and went back to the field rifle. 2 days later, he finished the reference document and submitted it to the compound service library. It was 12 pages. He had cross-referenced it against all 3 volumes and included a section on the non-standard components, with photographs and dimension tables, and a note about the high-temperature seal compound with a recipe for mixing it from base components, and a section on the sear geometry with measurements. He flagged it in the submission as Royal Household VEL Pattern Arm Maintenance Reference. Complete. Corrections to Standard Documentation *, and sent a copy to Wing 7 Logistics. He did not send a copy to Sarah Velnareth. He thought about it and decided it was a library document, not a personal communication, and the correct destination was the library. 3 days after that, he received a message. It came through the compound's internal system, flagged at a routing level he had not seen before, not urgent, not routine, but a category that the system labeled *personal, direct *, which he hadn't known existed until he saw it. He thought briefly that the system might be mislabeling something. Then he opened it. The reference document has been added to the Royal Household Workshop records. The workshops are being reopened. A pause in the message. He could read it in the phrasing, the slight irregularity of spacing that text messages had when the writer had stopped and restarted. If you are willing, I would welcome your consultation on the inventory. He read it twice. He thought about the workshop, closed 8 years, and the documentation that existed but was hard to find, and the 3 technicians who had looked at her weapon and not found the sear. He typed back, I'm willing. Let me know when is convenient. The first consultation was scheduled for 2 weeks out, at the Royal Household Annex on the eastern side of the compound, a section he had never had reason to visit. In the 2 weeks between the message and the consultation, he did not see Sarah Velnareth. The compound was large and their paths did not naturally cross. His work was in the armory. Her presence on the compound was diplomatic and administrative, and the architecture of the place meant that even 18 months had not required him to develop any awareness of where the senior Tharovan delegation was at any given time. He was aware of her now. In the peripheral way, he was aware of things he had flagged for attention. He did not think about it in any significant way. There was work. There was the field rifle and a backlog of 3 other service requests, and the follow-up mix of the SEAL compound, which he'd made enough of to keep in inventory. Yesen came by on the Thursday of the second week, ostensibly to return another reference volume. He looked at the volume. It was one she had borrowed 6 weeks ago and he had not needed back. He looked at her. "How did you know she'd come herself?" he said. Yesen sat down. "I didn't. I knew she might if the weapon was fixed correctly." "How did you know I'd document the seer properly?" "Because you returned that part's requisition corrected." She picked up the reference volume, looked at the spine, set it back down. The logistics officer was very offended. He went to the section chief about it. The section chief told him the requisition had been wrong and the correction was correct, and that was the end of it. A pause. "You didn't comment on it either way. You just fixed the requisition." "It was the right component number." "Yes." She looked at him with the particular warmth she had for things that she'd decided she approved of. "She asked me about you, you know, before she sent the weapon." He had suspected that. He hadn't asked. "What did you tell her?" "I told her you fixed the actual problem," Yesen said. "I also told her you were the best person I'd met at the compound for understanding what a thing was rather than what someone called it." She paused. "I thought she'd appreciate that." He thought about Sarah Velnareth standing in his reception area with the gray case. The way she'd said, "I wrote the work order myself asterisk." The way she had looked at him with that weighted attention. "She seems precise," he said. "She is very precise," Yesen agreed. "It makes people nervous." "I find it clear," he said. Yesen looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the returned reference volume and at the door and back at him. "You've been there every morning this week," she said. "Yes." "How many cabinets?" 3.5. There are 8. "So another 2.5 weeks, roughly, depending on what we find in the back cabinets." He thought about what Sarah had said about the 7 undocumented components and about the annotations in the inventory key. Possibly longer. Yesen looked at him with an expression he recognized. The specific expression she had when she knew something and was deciding how much of it to say. "Good," she said finally. "Good. You seem," she paused, choosing the word carefully. "Occupied," she said, "in the way you are when the work is real." He thought about the workshop and the 42-year-old handwriting and the quiet that had shifted from waiting to occupied. "The work is real," he said. "Yes," Yesen said. "I thought you might find that." "I find it clear," he said. Yesen looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said, "I thought you might." The royal household annex was quieter than the main armory. The workshop was well equipped, better than his, in some respects, with instruments he didn't have in the compound inventory. But it had the particular stillness of a space that had not been actively used in some time. There were 8 storage cabinets along one wall, a long central workbench, 2 reference volumes on a shelf above the bench, and a great deal of dust on the instrument covers. Sarah Velnareth was already there when he arrived. She was not in the working uniform he'd seen before. She was in something more informal, still the dark blue of what he was coming to understand as her color, but lighter, a fabric with a slight sheen, without the high collar. She was standing at the open first storage cabinet, looking at the inventory. She turned when he came in. The ambient quality of the space, the quietness, registered differently than his armory, which was quiet because it was focused. This was quiet because it had been waiting. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Of course." He set his kit on the workbench and came to look at the cabinet with her. The inventory was organized, he could see, but in an older system, labels in Tharovan script, which he read slowly, and beneath them numerical codes that matched a format he could cross-reference if he had the right key. "The inventory key," he said. "Third shelf, second volume." She moved back to give him room. He found the key. It was handwritten, 53 pages, the handwriting precise and consistent. He photographed the first 6 pages and paused. "How old is this?" he said. The last revision was 42 years ago. She was watching him from the other side of the bench. "My mother's mother kept the workshop." He nodded and kept photographing. He thought about the 60 years since a Vel-class royal household arm had been correctly serviced outside these walls, and about the 8 years the workshop had been closed, and about the fact that the inventory key was 42 years old, and about the sear that had been adjusted by a technician who almost certainly didn't know it was non-standard. "Some of what's in here," he said, "may not be documented anywhere else. I believe that's true of several items. Then we should probably start with a full inventory and a condition assessment before we touch anything." He set the camera down. "That will take time." "I have time," she said. "My presence on the compound is open-ended." He looked at her. She was watching him with that same quality of attention, still weighted, still direct, but there was something added to it now, in this quieter space, away from the guards and the aide and the formal architecture of the reception area. He noticed it. He did not immediately categorize it. "There are components in here that I won't be able to identify from the inventory alone," he said. "I'll need to compare them to reference material." "I have access to the royal household primary records," she said. "If you make a list of what you can identify, I can pull the original documentation. That would help significantly." "Good." She moved to the far end of the bench, pulled a stool, and sat. She had brought her own notepad. "Then we start at the beginning." He opened the first cabinet and started reading the first label. She wrote it down. He read the code and cross-referenced the key. She wrote that down too. They worked through the first cabinet in an hour and 20 minutes. He talked through what he found. She documented it. She asked 3 questions in that time, all precise, all relevant, all suggesting a specific technical knowledge that was not deep but was accurate. The way someone's knowledge was accurate when they had grown up around something without being trained in it. By the second cabinet, the working rhythm had settled. By the third, they had stopped narrating the process and were moving through it the way people moved through work that had found its own shape. She said at one point, while he was photographing a component he hadn't been able to immediately place, the sear. He looked up. "When you found it, when you realized what had been done to it, what did you think?" He thought about the question. It was specific, and he answered it specifically. "I thought the person who adjusted it had been working from what they had, and what they had was wrong. And I thought for a second that it was lucky the weapon hadn't cycled past the failure point in a serious situation." She was quiet for a moment. "It very nearly did," she said, 8 months ago." He looked at her. "There was a security situation," she said. It wasn't said dramatically, just stated the way she stated things. "I drew it. It cycled once and skipped." A pause. "I handled the situation by other means. But afterward I knew the weapon was wrong, and I had it looked at, and I was told it was functional." He thought about the skip pattern on the hammer face, the where he had measured and then corrected. He thought about what skipped during rapid cycling meant in a security situation. "I'm glad you had the other means," he said. She looked at him steadily. "So am I." There was a quality to the silence that followed, not uncomfortable, not weighted the way silences could be with people who were being careful with each other, but open. He had the sense that she did not often leave silences open like this. That precision was usually how she filled space, and that she was, just now, choosing not to. The consultation, she said after a moment. I framed it as consultation, but what I am asking is whether you would be willing to take this on fully. The inventory, the reference documentation, the workshop restoration, as an ongoing arrangement. He thought about that. He thought about the compound service library and the 12-page reference and the 3 volumes, and about the inventory key in handwriting 42 years old, and about the things in the 8 storage cabinets that might not be documented anywhere else. I'd like to do that, he said. She gave him the same expression he'd seen in the armory, the small controlled shift that was not quite a smile but was readable. Then, we continue tomorrow. I'll bring the full documentation kit. I will have the primary records pulled. She stood. Davin. He looked at her. She said his name with the same testing quality she had in the armory, but it was different now, not the sound of someone checking a thing, but the sound of someone who had already decided it was the right word. The reference document, she said. You put it in the library rather than sending it directly to me. It was a library document. Yes, a pause. It was also a gift. She picked up her notepad. I want you to know I understood that. He looked at her. I know you did, he said. She paused in the doorway. The light from the corridor was behind her, and in it the dark blue of her clothes was almost the same shade as the walls of the workshop, and her amber eyes caught the light from his side of the room and held it. Tomorrow, she said. Tomorrow, he said. They worked in the annex every morning for the next 3 weeks. It was not only work. He would have been honest about that if someone had asked him, which no one did. It was work in the way that most real work was, which meant it was also conversation and observation, and the gradual accumulation of knowledge about another person that happened when you were doing something together that mattered. He learned that she thought in sequences, that she documented things with the same obsessive accuracy she had, presumably, expected from him, that she had opinions about the inventory system's organizational logic that were sharp and correct, and that she had been sitting on for decades because the system was inherited and the person who made it was dead. She learned that he worked from the outside in on an unknown mechanism, that he had a specific sound he made when he found something he hadn't expected, not alarm, just attention sharpening, and that he could answer questions without stopping his hands, which she started to take advantage of, asking him to explain what he was doing as he did it, not because she didn't understand but because she liked the way he explained it. The first morning had been purely professional, inventory, documentation, the rhythm of 2 people calibrating a working method. The second morning had been similar, but looser, the calibration already done, the process more fluid. By the third morning, he had brought his full documentation kit and a secondary camera for component photography, and she had cleared the full central workbench and set up a reference station at the far end with the primary records she'd pulled overnight. He noticed that she had read the first 6 pages of the inventory key herself and annotated 2 of the entries. He noticed it because the annotations were in a smaller hand than the original key, and the ink was recent. These 2, he said, pointing at the annotations without touching the page. My grandmother corrected both entries verbally in my presence when I was young, she said. She was standing at the reference station, reviewing a document. She did not look up. I have been meaning to add the corrections for some time. How old were you? A pause. 7. He thought about a 7-year-old in a workshop, watching someone work, and a detail noted and kept for 40 years until there was a reason to write it down. Good memory, he said. She tested it, often. The faintest inflection in her voice, not quite warmth, but the edge of it. She believed that the knowledge in a workshop did not live in the documentation but in the person who used the documentation, that the documents were a map and the knowledge was the territory. He set down his camera. She was right. She was frequently right, Sarah said. I found it annoying when I was young. He went back to photographing. After a moment she said, Did you? Did I what? Have someone like that when you were young? He thought about it. My father maintained vehicles, civilian. He had the same principle. He said that a manual was a record of what someone knew once, and that you had to know enough to read it correctly or it would mislead you. He paused. He was talking about repair manuals, not weapons workshops, but the logic holds. The logic holds, she agreed. They worked in companionable quiet. He had spent enough time in workshops to know the difference between silence that was tension and silence that was two people comfortably in the same space. And this was clearly the latter, had been, actually, since the second morning, though he had not named it until now. He finished the photography on the second cabinet's third shelf and moved to the fourth. She made a note on her document and reached for the primary records folder for the next section. Your father, she said, he's still. He passed 4 years ago. He kept photographing. His workshop is still there. My sister runs it. A pause. I'm sorry. He had a good run, Davin said, which was true, and which was also the thing he said when this came up, because it was the most accurate thing he could say. He liked his work until the end. That matters. She was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said, I believe it does. He asked her at the end of the second week about the security situation, the one 8 months ago where the weapon had skipped. She told him. Not in detail. There were things she couldn't say, and he understood that, but in enough detail that he understood it had been serious, and that the weapon had mattered, and that the fact that it had been returned to her in a working condition by a technician who told her it was functional, without identifying the fault, had been a problem that went beyond the immediate incident. The report said functional, she said. I could not make the case that it wasn't because I had no documentation. I know, he said. That's why I documented the sear in the closeout. She looked at him. You knew I might need it. I thought you might want the record to be accurate. A pause. I didn't know the full context. But the documentation was the right thing to make, regardless. She was quiet for a moment. He kept working. He was partway through a detailed condition assessment of a component he was fairly sure was a rate limiter, which would mean it was the function of the track blade on her personal weapon, and he was cross-referencing the inventory key dimensions with a measurement he'd taken. The number matched. He wrote the measurement down and set the component on the bench beside the inventory key. He looked at the two of them, the old handwriting, the precise machined metal, for a moment. After the security situation, he said, when you submitted the weapon through Wing 7. Yes. How long did it take you to decide to do it that way? The general logistics channel, the false description. She considered. He had noticed over the weeks that she considered questions before answering them, not because she was slow to think but because she did not say approximate things. 3 days, she said. I spent the first day reviewing every official servicing channel available to me and determining that none of them would produce a different result from the ones I had already used. I spent the second day thinking about what kind of person would look at the problem rather than the documentation attached to it. A pause. The third day I spoke to Yes Sign. 3 days, he said. I was also managing the compound diplomatic schedule, she said, with that faint, dry inflection. It was not the only thing on my mind. He made a sound, something that was almost a laugh but didn't quite get there. She looked at him, and the amber in her eyes caught the light from his work lamp and held it for a moment. What was that? She said. Nothing, just I find you very precise. I find you very precise, she said. I thought we were discussing my scheduling. We were. He went back to the rate limiter. I appreciate the precision. I was saying so. She was quiet for a moment. He could feel her looking at him the way he could feel the work lamp, a directed warmth, present and steady. Davin, she said. Yes. The workshop after 3 weeks, She paused. Is it what you expected? He thought about the question. He thought about the 8 storage cabinets and the 42-year-old handwriting and the 7 undocumented components and the annotations in a hand he now recognized as hers. He thought about the rhythm they had found, the way the silence in the workshop had shifted from waiting to occupied. It's better, he said. A pause. Better than what? Better than expected. He looked up. The primary records are more complete than I thought they'd be. The inventory key is more systematic, and he paused. The company is better. She held his gaze for a long moment. The workshop was quiet around them, the afternoon light coming through the high narrow window on the eastern wall, the same light that would have come through for the 42 years the inventory key had been sitting on its shelf. Yes, she said. Her voice was measured, but not by effort. The measurement had gone out of it. It is. I've read about your service record, she said. He looked up. Not recently, before, when Yesen gave me your name. She held his gaze. The note about the corroded relay, the 4-page report. My section chief said it was thorough, he said. The section chief wrote that you had spent 3 weeks on a fault that 2 previous technicians had missed. She paused. That you found it in a panel that hadn't been opened in 4 years. The fault was intermittent. You had to catch it at the right moment. Yes, she said, and you waited for the right moment. He thought about the 3 weeks, the way the fault had appeared and disappeared and appeared again, the way he'd mapped its behavior over time until he knew when to look. It wasn't patience exactly. It was just, the work told me what it needed. She was looking at him with the weighted attention again, but it had a warmth in it now that had been building over 3 weeks, the kind of warmth that came from accumulated things, from shared work, and the particular shorthand that developed inside shared work, from knowing the sound he made when he found something unexpected, from the way he had told her about the seer without softening it, and had put the documentation in the library without sending it as a personal gesture. You said that before, she said. When I asked about the seer, the work told me what it needed. It's true of most work. Most people find it easier to decide what a thing needs before they look at it. A pause. You look first. He thought about the gray case on the bottom of his intake tray, and the 3 days he'd spent on research before he touched the seer adjustment, and the parts request for the non-standard spring that he'd filed rather than installing a close-fit component. It saves time, he said. She smiled. It was not the small controlled shift. It was a real smile, fuller, with something in it that was undefended. He had not seen it before. He filed it carefully, the way he filed things he intended to retrieve. Davin, she said. Yes. There is a formal reception next week, the compound administration. She paused. I am required to attend. I generally find them, a pause considered. Manageable, she said finally, with the faint specific irony of someone describing something as manageable that was, in her internal register, something else entirely. He thought about the reception, which he had seen on the compound calendar and had not planned to attend, because he was not required to, and the food was generally unremarkable, and he was better at rooms that had a clear purpose. Are you asking me to come? He said. I am asking if you would be willing to come. She held his gaze. There is a difference. There was. He thought about the difference, and about the fact that she knew there was a difference and had said so, and about the 3 weeks of mornings in the annex, and about the way she had said tomorrow in the doorway, the first evening with the light from the corridor behind her. I'm willing, he said. The smile was back, brief, controlled again, but there. Good, she said. The reference documentation for the Cabinet 6 components will take until Thursday. We can discuss the details then. He nodded and went back to the rate limiter. She went back to her notepad. The workshop was quiet. It had stopped being a space that was waiting and had become something else. A space that was occupied, that had work in it, and the particular warmth of two people who had decided, without negotiating it explicitly, that they preferred the same room. He measured the rate limiter twice. The dimensions matched the inventory key. He wrote it down. Outside the annex, the compound was its usual busy self, diplomatic schedules and logistics meetings, and the low-level permanent motion of a place that housed hundreds of people from 18 species doing the work of an integrated world. Inside, it was quiet and precise, and he thought, very much the shape of something he intended to keep. The reception was, as expected, large and ambient and not particularly to his taste. She found him within the first 10 minutes, which he appreciated. She was in court dress, a deep blue more formal than the working uniform, with the ceremonial marks of office, and she looked entirely like the briefing photographs and also entirely unlike them, because he knew now the difference between the composed authority she wore in public and the quality of attention she turned on things that interested her. She handed him a drink and stood with him at the edge of the room with the specific ease of someone who was technically hosting and technically circulating, and had decided, for this portion of the evening, to be in one place. "You came," she said. "I said I would." "Yes," a pause. "You generally do what you say." "So do you," he said. She looked at him sideways. The ambient noise of the reception, voices in 6 languages, the particular social register of diplomatic occasions, someone near the center of the room saying something that made a group of Tharovan officials laugh, came and went around them. "The rate limiter," she said. "You're going to tell me it's the same component as the track blade in the frame of my personal weapon." "It is." "Which means the workshop inventory has a replacement part for a component that isn't documented in any of the 3 volumes in the compound library. Which is why I photographed the inventory key." He paused. "I've been cross-referencing it with the Royal Household primary records you sent me. There are 7 components in the cabinets that don't appear in any of the publicly available documentation." She was quiet for a moment. 60 years, she said. "Longer than that, probably. Some of this predates the public documentation by a generation." She held the drink, turned it once in her hand. "When we're done with the inventory," she said, and then stopped. "When we're done with the inventory," he said, "I can write it up, a full reference, everything in the cabinets cross-referenced against the primary records." "That would take considerable time." "Yes." She looked at him. "Your compound posting," she said. "How long is the current term?" 8 months remaining. "And after that?" He thought about the patrol vessel and the sector station and the naval repair bay, and about all the service libraries he'd worked from that had wrong information in them, and the way you could tell, after a while, which facts you could trust and which you had to verify yourself, because someone had copied them from something that had copied them from something that had been wrong to begin with. He thought about the 8 storage cabinets and 42-year-old handwriting, and the 7 undocumented components, and the workshop that had been closed for 8 years and was now open. "I haven't decided," he said. She looked at him steadily. "I would like you to consider the possibility of a longer arrangement," she said. "The workshop, the documentation project," a pause, "the compound. There are ways to extend a posting if both parties wish it." He thought about the word both asterisk. "I'll consider it," he said. She held his gaze for a moment, the weighted attention, the warmth in it that had accumulated over 3 weeks of mornings and was now, here in the formal noise of the reception, entirely clear. "Good," she said. They stood at the edge of the room together for a while longer, and the reception moved around them, and the noise was the noise of a world that was integrated and complicated, and full of problems that required careful documentation and patience, and the willingness to look before you touched. He thought about her weapon, repaired and functioning, and the reference in the library, and the workshop reopened after 8 years, and the 7 components that existed nowhere in the public record. He thought about asterisk both parties. He thought tomorrow. She said a little while later without looking at him, just watching the room. I read your service record again last week. What did you find? That every posting you've left has been in better condition than when you arrived. A pause. Every service library updated, every inventory corrected. She turned to look at him. You leave things better. He thought about the corroded relay and the 4-page report and the 12-page reference in the compound library, and the way Yesen had said she'd appreciate that. It's easier than leaving them the same, he said. She looked at him with the real smile, the full one, undefended, and it lasted a moment longer than the others had. Yes, she said, I know exactly what you mean. The reception continued around them, and neither of them moved. Someone across the room said something in formal Tharovan that indicated a toast was coming, and there was a general shuffle and realignment of glasses. She turned slightly, acknowledging it with the composed authority she wore in public, and then turned back to him. Tomorrow, she said quietly under the noise of the toast. He raised his glass a fraction, which was the only answer the moment required. Tomorrow, he said. The compound moved around them in all its 18 species, integrated world complexity, and inside it, 2 people stood at the edge of a room that was too loud and too formal and not at all the right shape for the kind of work they had found themselves doing, and were content, for the moment, to be exactly there.